Good evening. So glad to see so many of you here tonight for our really excellent program. It's something that I've been looking forward to, and really glad to welcome Richard Bush back to Asia Society. I think this is the first time, I was comparing notes with Richard earlier, it is really the first time Richard has spoken for us formally in this building since we've been here for almost 5 years. So it is really a delight for us to welcome Richard here to talk about a subject that's very close to all our hearts, Hong Kong in the shadow of China. And so wonderful to see so many of our friends from the various consulate here. Tonight we have about representative from 11 consulates. And I just want to single out the U.S. Consul General because I think it's his maiden trip to Asia Society Hong Kong Center, Consul General Kurt Tong. Kurt, welcome. I hope to see you. Your predecessor is also here tonight. From that experience, we know he was a frequent visitor, so I look forward to seeing your return many times. And I also want to recognize the Consul General from Austria, Belgium, Mongolia, Pakistan, Poland, Turkey. And also, we have the deputy representative, deputy CG from Netherlands, from Philippines, as well as from, I think we also have the CG from Malaysia and representative from Kuwait. So welcome to our consulate friends. It's always a delight. And before coming down, I also counted, as many of you know, our programs here at Asia Society, we pride ourselves on including students. Even before we moved to the center, all of our programs, we always welcome students, and they come for free. So tonight's program, I counted, we have, there were about 100 people in the audience tonight, about a quarter of you are students, and they come from all of the universities in Hong Kong. So students, welcome, and thank you for being with us. So I think with that, I wanted to just kind of remind you, there are some great programs coming up. I think there's one next week, next Monday on U.S. foreign policy under the two candidates or two whatever's going on in the States right now. Maybe Richard, who came in from Washington, can enlighten us on what is happening in Washington and United States today. And feel free, students, I expect some tough questions. It's not just here, we're talking about a new leadership selection for next year, but also in less than a month, there'll be an important election in the United States. And so I'm sure Richard can enlighten us on those subjects. So before Richard comes on, I'm going to welcome our chairman, who will formally introduce our speaker tonight. So thank you.
This will be short. We want to make sure that we have plenty of time for my longtime friend, Richard. No doubt you will find Richard very, very bright, but you may not know why. And the reason is because between 1960 and 1965, in the formative year of Richard, he lived in Hong Kong. Great reason, Richard. We're so delighted to contribute to such brain power in the world, in particular in the foreign service policy think tank area. Every year, I pay my respect to Brookings institution and always go see Richard. Always have a very interesting dialogue. May not always agree, but it's okay. And it's really interesting to have someone who knows this part of the world from the United States, but live in this part of the world, not just Hong Kong, but also Taiwan, as a top person from the United States, representative in the Taiwan, what we call that office. And I think a lot of people are waiting to hear what you have to say about Hong Kong. What do we not know? And what are we wrong in? And then, of course, we have a lot of time for Q&A, and we'll tell you perhaps later, Richard, maybe you're right, or maybe you're wrong. And that's the beauty of the Asia Society. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Richard Bush.
Ronnie, thank you very much for that generous and kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here to talk about my book. I actually owe Hong Kong a lot because it was because I lived here during the early 1960s that I ultimately decided to do China as a career. And I'm still doing it. But Hong Kong launched me. I didn't expect that, but that's what happened. I went to King George V School And I learned absolutely nothing about China there, absolutely nothing. But it was the experience of living in this very interesting Chinese society that it stuck with me and had a powerful hold on me. I suspect that there is very little that I will have to say tonight or that I write in my book that you don't in some way already know. But I'm here anyway, and I do look forward to the Q&A. One reason I wrote this book is that Hong Kong gets no coverage in the United States. And it needs more coverage because it's a really interesting story. I'm really happy to see a lot of old friends here tonight. I have a lot of friends in Hong Kong and I value them all. And I do look forward to our conversation. If I could recommend the program next week, Ivo Dalder, who's going to speak to you, is a former colleague from Brookings, and he's far more dynamic than I am. And he will have a lot to say, and I'm sure it'll be very informative. I started this book project out summer of 2013. I was looking around for a topic, and I sort of knew that the next couple of years in Hong Kong would be really interesting, but I didn't know how interesting. And it's been very exciting for me to observe what's going on, what went on, and try to make sense of it. As a friend of mine said earlier in the drinks time, it's not always easy to figure out why things happen here. And I did the best I could. I think the events of 2014 and 2015 produced two conflicting narratives about what happened and why. At least that's the way it seemed from 12 time zones away. In one of these narratives, a coalition of politicians, academics, spoiled adolescents, and radical activists, these are other people's characterizations, not mine. This coalition sought to block the adoption of an act of generosity by the Chinese central government. And there were two attitudes that drove this obstructionism, it was said in this narrative. The first was a lack of gratitude for all that the motherland had done for the city since its return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. And with that, a disregard of the central government's interests. The second and more serious attitude that produced obstructionism was, in this narrative, a rejection of the very idea that the Hong Kong SAR was a part of China in the first place. And in some quarters, as you know better than I, this has translated into a desire for political independence. So this story described a struggle between chaos and order, treason and patriotism, and the few against the many. The second narrative told a very different story, and here the story was of a struggle of courageous democracy fighters against a repressive Chinese government. And you had activists who campaigned in Hong Kong for, and here I quote an American observer, quote, the right of all citizens to choose their leaders and shape their future, and so challenge a Beijing government that has, quote, fierce determination to curtail self-rule and direct elections. This narrative was a contest between good and evil, democratic values versus Leninist realpolitik, and the Hong Kong David against the Beijing Goliath. I think that these two narratives are really sort of morality plays than a good account of reality. They distort reality as much as they illuminate it. My own analysis and the evidence upon which it's based suggests a different interpretation. In my narrative, for what it's worth, electoral reform failed in Hong Kong not because the central government was evil or because the SAR government's ultimate plan was fundamentally flawed. It wasn't a perfect plan by any means. No government proposal ever is. But the government's plan did create a pathway to competitive elections in which I think the right kind of democratic candidate could win. True, the pathway was narrow. It required Democrats to be strategic and at least make a modest and moderating leap of faith about Beijing's intentions, but there was a path. Also true, I think, Beijing's tactics were sometimes heavy-handed and ill-timed. It should have offered more concessions earlier in the game, but by the end of the day, the central government did support a mechanism that could have produced a moderate Democrat as chief executive, and later on, a legislative council with no more functional constituencies. I happen to believe that the majority of Hong Kong people were sincere in their longstanding desire for wider democracy. They were also frustrated by the city's entrenched inequality. At the same time, in my view, some in the opposition camp preferred to oppose for the sake of opposition or to seek a perfection that could never be realized. To be frank, and here I'm probably showing my age, politics never produces perfection. The best that can usually be hoped for are outcomes that are good enough. Idealism certainly has a place in all of this, but so does realism and pragmatism. In the end, I think what sank electoral reform was not irreconcilable differences, but misperception, miscalculation, mistrust, poor judgment, and missed opportunities. In my tale, at least, there were no heroes and villains. What happened instead was that key actors on each side failed at key points to engage realistically with their opposite numbers to construct a mutually acceptable solution. Process overwhelmed substance. And because the tragedy was not foreordained, I regard it as a regrettable tragedy. With 2020 hindsight, I can see some things that happened that helped produce the outcome. I'm not going to go into those. I said this was a tragedy. I think it was a double tragedy, actually. First, of course, is the missed opportunity to further democratize Hong Kong's political system. But second, it also has made it much harder to address policy issues concerning the city's competitiveness and governance. And I spend a good bit in the book talking about that. It has become more difficult to grapple with problems like the aging population. Gridlock continues, and the policy agenda suffers. The United States, to be sure, has similar difficulties. We have many policy problems that cry out for attention, but our political system is in stalemate. Public faith in politics continues to decline. If you want to talk about that more in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. I don't have much doubt that Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. I do doubt that she will be able to govern effectively under current circumstances, even though she would really like to govern and address problems. Back to Hong Kong. I'm sure that I don't have to tell you that the election of all major leaders by popular vote is not just an end in itself, but also a means to an end. Political leaders who are selected by popular vote do enjoy presumptive legitimacy because of the way they're selected. They therefore have the public's support and confidence at least on the day that they take the oath of office. After that, it's anybody's guess. In order to sustain support and legitimacy, those leaders must fulfill the public's expectations concerning their performance. The goal of modern government really is to undertake policies that benefit society as a whole and improve the people's well-being. Otherwise, they or their party or their political camp will not remain in power. and ultimately legitimacy is sustained and has to be sustained by good performance. Now, there are cases and special circumstances where unelected governments perform well. I think in a number of respects, the mainland is one of those sets of circumstances. Hong Kong was another one of those cases. The British colonial government was never perfect, and it was sometimes slow to respond to the needs of society. Sometimes it took riots to get the British government to recognize the need for better education or social welfare and so on. But the colonial government did create the policy environment in which companies could make profits and individuals and families could improve and assure their standard of living. The keys were limited intervention in the economy, rule of law, and an effective civil service. But you know all that, so I'm not going to go into detail. I think we all know that it's impossible for Hong Kong to go back to those days of government without politics. Hong Kong may have been an economic city when I lived here and into the 1980s, but it quickly became a political city. There were many reasons for this to happen. One certainly were the provisions in the Basic Law that guaranteed the rule of law and civil and political rights, and the selection of half of LegCo through popular elections. One of my gurus for understanding modern politics and government is Francis Fukuyama at Stanford University. He argues that a successful political system needs three essential pillars for success. First, an autonomous, strong, and capable state structure. Second, the rule of law. And third, political mechanisms that hold leaders accountable for their actions and their performance. I suspect that if Professor Fukuyama were to look at Hong Kong, he would conclude that his three pillars range from good to not bad here. Civil service remains quite capable, even though there are always improvements that could be made. Public expectations of the civil service have gone up. The rule of law is strong, and it will remain strong as long as there is vigilance about protecting the judiciary's independence. Although Fukuyama might say that Beijing waited too long to end functional constituencies and the selection of the chief executive on a small scale basis, the public does have an array of other ways to hold officials accountable. Professor Fukuyama does not believe, however, that political systems always develop in a positive direction. Indeed, they can undergo political decay and become corrupt and ineffective in doing their job. He's certainly critical of such negative trends in the United States political system, and I'm afraid I have to agree with him. If he looked for signs of political decay in Hong Kong, he might point to some decline in the autonomy of the civil service, cases of corruption involving senior officials, and the emergence of what he calls veto-ocracy, by which he means the ability of small groups of politicians or civil society groups to block government initiatives that really are required. He would likely say that Hong Kong is ready for popular elections and will be better governed if it has them. Now, one source of concern to my mind is some evidence that some parts of the foundation for the successful implementation of one country, two systems in Hong Kong are under threat. There are new signs of efforts to circumscribe political freedoms. We see nibbling away in the mass media and university autonomy. More serious, I think, are actions that undermine the rule of law and violate the Basic Law itself. And I refer particularly to the detention of Mr. Li Bo late last year. I'm actually inclined to believe that this was not an action directed by the central government, and that central leaders understood and understand the need to ensure that such things don't happen again. I hope I'm right. Now, some in the mainland may have concluded from the events of recent years that the central government granted too many freedoms in Hong Kong and too strong a rule of law, and that these need to be restricted. If that is the option that Beijing chooses, and if those sentiments ever become policy, the result may be less stability rather than more, and China's international reputation would probably suffer. Now, another option that seems to be available to Beijing is to muddle through, to continue the status quo. I'm not sure that's an optimal option either. The governance stalemate, I suspect, would probably continue. Policy problems would fester unaddressed. Political alienation would deepen, and protests would continue. So even though political reform failed last year, to my mind, the best option is not to give up on the project, and that is to revive it at the appropriate time. And so perhaps after the CCP holds its 19th Party Congress next year, it will give a green light to a new effort to reform the selection for both the CE and LegCo. To be successful at a minimum, it seems it will be necessary to build trust with those leaders in the anti-establishment camp who are willing to give Beijing the benefit of the doubt. It will likely be necessary to sweeten the proposal that was voted down in 2015. All of this, of course, is easy for me to say. It's very hard for leaders here and in Beijing to do. Perhaps I'm being excessively optimistic in my belief that a more democratic Hong Kong would actually be a more stable Hong Kong. And the reason I think that is that I believe that those citizens who are currently alienated from the current system might recalculate what is possible by working through reformed institutions and decide to give them a try. It would be a shame if Hong Kong were resigned to a political future that is either a continuation of the status quo or something worse. It would be a shame if some people in Hong Kong decided to imitate those in the colonial period who felt that only rioting would command proper governmental attention to these problems. What I'm not saying, and please don't get me wrong, what I'm not saying is that simply moving to popular elections for the chief executive and all of LegCo will solve all of Hong Kong's political problems. It will not. There are a lot of other institutional fixes that will likely need to be made to increase the chances that government will reform well. Popular elections may have become a necessary condition for good governance, but they are certainly not a sufficient condition. The same logic applies to the economy. All advanced economies will have to be quite nimble if they are to continue to compete with the large and increasingly capable China. Hong Kong, which has so far successfully found new sources of comparative advantage, is no exception. All of you know better than I suspect, that the sectors that are the sources of the city's current growth will not be the sources tomorrow. Of course, it is the private sector that will be on the front lines of meeting the competitiveness challenge. But there is a role as well for government. And if government doesn't work, for reasons we understand, then meeting the challenge will be all the more difficult. As counterintuitive as it may seem, moving towards popular elections may be the only way, excuse me, may be the only way to foster a more productive interaction between the executive and the legislature, between the people and the government, and so improve the performance of government as a whole. Then there are the high levels of inequality of income, wealth, and access to education, employment, and housing, and the impact of inequality on both economics and politics. Economists debate how important it is to reduce inequality in order to preserve a competitive and growing economy. Clearly, the inequality that all economies today are experiencing has many causes, globalization, technological change, and so on. But I'm inclined to side with those economists who argue that a large and well-off middle class, that is, moderate levels of inequality, is essential for sustaining growth in a mass consumption economy because it's a large middle class that generates higher levels of demand through its consumption. In most advanced economies, economic inequality has also produced political alienation. Witness the unexpected strength of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the United States. Hong Kong's no different. Hong Kong is something of a special case because elections have occurred for only a half of LegCo, more or less. Those who see inequality as the most important issue affecting their lives have had no outlet for changing the status quo. And for them, gaining a fully democratic system is the way to address inequality. Because of these factors, it may be necessary to move to popular elections to give many in the public the confidence that the political system will work for them to reduce inequality and assure a good life for themselves and their family. Full democracy by itself won't guarantee a solution to the problems of inequality, but it has probably become part of the solution, and it could well enhance stability. I understand that popular elections will no doubt create pressures for more spending on social welfare, but the needs of the aging population is probably going to make spending inevitable anyway. By way of conclusion, let me admit that the subtitle of my book may be rather obscure. The subtitle is Living with the Leviathan. And the word Leviathan is a reference to the title of the political classic by Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English theorist. And in this book, he argued that the political order depends on the existence and acceptance of a sovereign authority. For better or for worse, I think, the central government is Hong Kong's sovereign, and the people of the city will have to live with that sovereign, for better or for worse. Ultimately, it is the central government that will decide which option to pursue concerning Hong Kong, whether it's stick with the status quo, restrict the political freedoms that exist today, or surprise the city by reinvigorating electoral reform. I understand all the reasons why the central government might be reluctant to provide Hong Kong with a pleasant surprise, but I still hope it happens. Alone, popular elections will not guarantee good governance and political stability here, but it may have become the necessary first step. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, the floor is open. There's a lot of questions, I'm sure. I certainly have a lot, but leave it to you first.
Do you want to field them? That's a question.
Now, I warn you, if you don't ask questions, I will be asking questions. By the way, let me first recognize three people here. We missed the New Zealand CG here. Gabby, great to have you. In whatever where you come, you are always welcome. And then we also have the president of Northeastern University in Boston, President Joseph Aoun and his wife, Mrs. Aoun. Great to have you. They used to be with USC, my alma mater, but they have gone on to higher things, so wonderful to have you. Okay, back to Hong Kong. At the back. And then Edith at the front.
Thank you very much for the great speech. From the scale of 1 to 10, how freely do you think you can talk about the issue of independence right here, right now?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
From 1 to 10, how freely do you think you can talk about the issue of independence right here, right now?
10 being the freest, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, clearly, electoral candidates who advocate independence have trouble even running for office. And it's my understanding that this is a difficult topic to discuss in secondary schools. I actually think the more discussion, the better. Maybe not in secondary schools, but in society as a whole. I think that is the only way that people will work through the logic of their position, either for or against independence, and realize both what's possible in politics and what's necessary. Coming back to your sort of scale at the beginning, I would probably give it around a 7, but think that maybe it'd be better if it was a 9. So, Edith?
But sorry, Edith, can you hold 1 second? Richard, if you are still a consul general of sorts or government officials, then obviously you have very little liberty to speak on that subject, I assume. Mm-hmm. But as a private citizen, I suppose the situation is a bit different, isn't it?
Yes. I think for U.S. government officials...
or any government.
Yes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the U.S. government has said pretty clearly that Hong Kong is a part of China, and we respect the basic law. My personal view is that that bridge was crossed some time ago, and the decision was made by the British government and the Chinese government, and the Hong Kong people had very little say in the matter. But we've gone to the point where this is probably not a realistic option. I think I can understand the logic of people who say that, they're so dissatisfied with the situation here that the only alternative that makes sense is independence. But realistically, I don't see the central government considering it.
Edith? Edith, can you get the mic?
Welcome back to Hong Kong, Richard.
Thank you.
My question is, Anson Chan and Martin Lee are now in Australia and on the way to New Zealand, and basically arguing that Hong Kong is slipping into a kind of morass of Chinese influence and Chinese domination, and this is a lesson for other countries, starting with Australia and New Zealand, and suggests that China's counterparts, particularly the U.S., should adopt a more hostile realpolitik stance to China. So I just wanted to bounce that off you to see how much traction that kind of view is getting in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Well, as some of my friends who work in the State Department will tell you, we have many interests here in Hong Kong, among them political development. My own personal view is that where the United States and other countries should be prepared to draw the line and make Hong Kong a more salient issue of their China policy is if the central government indeed moves to restrict the freedoms that were granted in the Basic Law and the the integrity of the rule of law itself. And that remains very important. I'm a little bit optimistic that perhaps after the 19th Party Congress this can be reopened, the issue of electoral reform. I hope it can be. There may be ways that other governments behind the scenes can help, but I think things have to be worked out here. Let me say that I have a lot of respect for what Anson Chan and Hong Kong 2020 tried to do in the discussions around electoral reform and trying to find ways to improve the nominating committee, but within the parameters that Beijing had set down. I'm sorry that those didn't go further. The solution might have been very different.
The lady in the third row. Anybody else? Okay, after that, the gentleman right here, and then in front.
Yeah, a quick question on really to clarify what you meant by these three options that the Chinese government has. They break down supposedly too costly in terms of reputation for China. Second model through also costly because of still people won't be happy with that, if I understood you correctly. And the third, to me, was surprising because, okay, go back to what didn't work. Let's make it work this time. So is that normative or positive? My point is that something you wish to happen, or are there strong reasons for you to believe that this third beautiful option is really an option?
One of the things that has happened sort of in the last few years is that, clearly the central government has become more nervous about the trends here. And face some dilemmas in what to do about it. And one of them is to hunker down and maybe sort of make Hong Kong more like the mainland and just try to ride it out. But my own view is that perhaps if it's political stability and sort of general acceptance of one country, two systems, maybe the counterintuitive thing is the right way to go back to electoral reform and to give people who now do not believe they have a stake in the system, who believe that the institutions of government don't work for them, a reason to change their mind. Is this likely? Perhaps not, for reasons that you understand better than I do. But unless you think through the option, the good option and why to do it, it never gets considered. One of my points of reference here is Taiwan in the 1980s, and there it was a very different situation, and but it still had the same features of sort of deadlock and stalemate. And President Zhang Jingguo had the counterintuitive insight, I think, that the best way for the Kuomintang to maintain its control on power was to open up the system, not to try to increase repression. And that worked, not always in ways that we might have preferred, but I think Taiwan is probably a more stable society today than it was then, because the system was liberalized and democratized.
The gentleman in the second row, and then front lady here.
Hi, Dr. Bush.
Yes.
Thank you for being here tonight. My question plays off your last answer. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the differences and similarities between Hong Kong and Taiwan. So recently, Tsai Ing-wen told the Wall Street Journal that, of course, the cases between Hong Kong and Taiwan politically are, of course, different. But I'd like to ask specifically about what we've seen in sort of a rise in the third forces, so-called third forces in Hong Kong, the so-called localists, in Taiwan, the New Power Party. Do you think there's an opportunity for them to work together or learn from each other? And if I can add to that, do you think that throws a curveball for U.S. representatives such as Mr. Tong, Mr. Kim Moy, and how they approach relations with Hong Kong and Taiwan? Thank you.
Well, I have total confidence in U.S. representatives in any of these places. We've been through things like this before, and we'll get through them again. There are some ways in which the problems that Taiwan faces are similar to the problems that are faced in Hong Kong, and it's the problems of all advanced economies, and among them, giving young people confidence that their standard of living and way of life can approximate that of their parents. If you're a young person who's looking at a future that is worse in terms of material conditions and psychological satisfaction, you're not going to be a very happy person. And so the answers to that are partly political, they're partly economic. They're not easy answers. The United States faces similar problems. I do believe that from the point of view of people in Taiwan, the average person in Taiwan, whatever the Beijing government says about the one country, two systems formula applying to both, that Taiwan people regard the two cases as very different. And whatever sympathy they may have for people here in Hong Kong, whatever some people in Taiwan do to try and help out their counterparts here, folks in Taiwan are focused on their own set of problems and their own sort of different dilemmas with the mainland.
In front.
You mentioned Hong Kong's competitive advantages and said that they would be changing over the next couple of decades. How would you characterize them today?
Well, I think the sectors that are strong are financial services, things related to the legal system and the rule of law. Tourism has been, but that's a question mark. All the sort of different businesses that are related to tourism. I suspect that Beijing finds Hong Kong a real asset in internationalizing the RMB, but that process will sort of end at some point. So what are the future sources of growth? I'm not an economist, I'm not a businessman, so I may be the last person who should be answering that question. Maybe Ronnie should answer it. But I think that it's more in the areas of innovation, technology, creative industries, healthcare. If you have a lot of people who are retired and facing health issues, that should create a demand for more health services. Then the question is, what government policies do you need to facilitate an easy and successful migration to those new sources of growth? Easy for me to say, very hard to do.
The gentleman by the window.
Where do Hong Kong's tycoons fit in all of this?
I'm sorry?
Where do Hong Kong's tycoons fit in all of this?
Isn't that a good question? Let me put myself in the position of a tycoon, and which is something that I have no basis on which to do, really, because I've never been that fortunate or successful in my life. But I might come to the conclusion that in order to continue to run a profitable business, I do need political stability. I do need a legco that can get things done. I do need a government that is not sort of hamstrung in trying to carry out policy initiatives. And perhaps I might then come to the conclusion that the forces that are challenging government are going to exist whatever the nature of the political system is. They'll just find different outlets. And so maybe it's better to bring them into the system by sort of liberalizing the system even more and making it more competitive, rather than by sort of shutting off those options. But as I say, it's hard for me to speak for tycoons. Just a guess.
The gentleman last from the third row. Anybody else? After that, we should have about 15, 20 minutes.
I want one of your questions.
Huh?
I want one of your questions.
Oh, sure, I will ask you.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Dr. Bush, what are the risks that by adopting your proposal of encouraging more democracy in Hong Kong, that the tendency for you actually encourage a tendency for ultimately accumulating in more independence, the kind of call for independence? From the central government's point of view, isn't that one of the concerns that there will be? And then secondly, it seems to me that most of the people in Hong Kong are actually most interested in economic prosperity and making a living. And I think that, all this kind of a democracy talk seems to be, if you create political instability, is actually bad for the people of Hong Kong.
Well, I think the logic of what I was saying before is that, if the current status quo persists, there's going to be instability whether you have democracy or not. It's more a question of where it comes from and how it's processed. By this point, the sentiment in some quarters for a very different relationship with the central government exists. It's perhaps regrettable that came about. My answer to all of that is let the voters decide. I mean, I agree with you. I think that, the important issues for most Hong Kong people are livelihood issues and having a good life. I think most Hong Kong people are pretty pragmatic and even conservative. So to the extent that some people in society offer a very different approach, they don't have the votes to do it, or I suspect that they don't have the votes to do it.
Alice?
Richard, I have a question regarding generational shifts.
Yes.
Because when you mentioned Taiwan, and one of the things that struck me 2 years ago when Occupy Central was in front of us, a lot of it was to do with technology and also the youth, the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan, and then Arab Spring and all that. How do you think technology is playing into this? I mean, in some ways, my understanding from 2 years ago was Snapchat really got a great boost from the student movements here in Hong Kong. So I'm curious your take from Washington, in terms of technology. Even I think at this last debate, hearing Donald Trump touting how he has used Twitter. And also, on that same level, I think in terms of China's use of technology, the social media, I'm curious your view from Washington, this area of generational shift and also technology's role in it.
It's a great question. You're asking somebody who's approaching his 69th birthday, so I may be psychologically ill-equipped to answer the question, but as a student of politics, what you're referring to is really fascinating. Clearly, we have a generation that grew up in prosperity and have moved on to other concerns. Some might call it a post-materialist sensibility. They also have at their disposal techniques of mobilization that never existed before, but allow mobilization of vast numbers of people, probably beyond their own expectations or the expectations of the mobilizers. All the more important, I would say, is to have sufficient channels so that the demands of society can be processed in an institutionalized way. That may not yet be enough. I think that governments today all around the world are wrestling with how to balance participation with institutions. I'm old-fashioned. I hope that people maintain their confidence in institutions. For that to happen, they have to work well. And, in the United States, they don't always work well. And so it creates sometimes a Trump or Sanders phenomenon. But we are in a new world here.
The gentleman in the middle.
Yes, early on you mentioned that in a maybe less adversarial situation, that the central government might see its way to accepting a moderate Democrat as a chief executive. There's certainly people who would say that the August 31st, 2014 white paper would suggest that Beijing has no interest in such a person. And in a way, why would the central government support a chief executive who would be basically at odds with the ethos of the CCP?
I would refer you I understand the question and the import of the question. My conclusion is drawn from my own analysis of the April 22nd, 2015 proposal that the Hong Kong SAR government made to LegCo that covered the details of electoral reform and essentially created a two-stage process. And I go in, I'm not going to bore you with my wonky kind of analysis of that, but I think that in a situation where Democrats were strategic and willing to put up one candidate who appealed to the center of society, it would have been very hard to shut that person out from the final stage of the election. I think we could probably sit down and identify 4 or 5 people who might be people who Beijing would be willing to take a chance on. I think the central government understood that. They knew the import of this proposal and its implications.
Any more? I invite all the Consul General, if you care to make comments. I'm sure Richard doesn't mind. It's up to you. So anyone else? If not, I'm going to have a dialogue with this gentleman. Okay, last one. In front, please.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. This question may be overly predictive.
Yes.
And in that case, perhaps looking into your crystal ball might be a little bit too much to ask. But what would your views be on how the next flare-up will play out? And
About the next what?
The next flare-up
Flare up.
will play out, because there will be another flare-up, and every thinking person in Hong Kong really is aware of that fact. So what do you think will happen the next time we see Occupy Mark II? Overly predictive, I recognise,
Yes.
but nevertheless.
Well, I accept your premise. I hope that the Hong Kong authorities respond in a way similar to how they ended up during the Occupy movement. What happened in September of 2014 was a surprise, and so, but where the authorities ended up, I think, was not bad. I'm not sure authorities in the United States would have accepted the occupation of public spaces for that length of time. I think that the next flare-up, or I hope the next flare-up would reinforce the importance of revisiting reform in a way that's more effective than how the last round ended up. I hope it would reinforce the judgment that unless something along those lines is done, that flare-ups will continue to occur. I mean, that's it's not what anybody wants, but the logic of the situation suggests it. I mean, what I would really worry about is Beijing deciding to hell with it. We've provided too many freedoms. They're being exploited by people who don't respect our interests, and we need to take some away. That's a really bad outcome for all concerned.
I invite David Lee to make some comments. David is not only very knowledgeable Hong Kong affairs, but he's also very well connected in both Taiwan and Beijing. David?
Hello, Richard. I just thought from a different angle to look at this. What is your thought about the Beijing perspective regarding what in the last 20 years? Because I, for one, has been embarking this journey in 1984. And I truly believe, and I still believe, Beijing have never really sort of backed off on the one country, two system. In the road, there's some hiccups and so, but unfortunately, the marketing people were not able, the marketing people were not able to sell to the people of Hong Kong that they really mean this is truly what we want for Hong Kong. So any thought and suggestion for our friends in Beijing?
Let me make a couple of comments at the outset. I think the city that Beijing thought it was going to get when it signed the declaration in 1984 was not the city it inherited, because there was profound changes in society.
Between 84 and 97.
Between 84 and 97. And you understand the reasons for that. I also think, and I've read somewhere, that the British very skillfully sold Beijing, I mean, during the negotiations on the joint declaration, sold Beijing on the idea that in order to preserve a capitalist system, the second system, you needed the rule of law and civil and political rights. That these were instrumental towards Beijing's fundamental goal. And nobody knew the ways in which those rights would be exercised. I guess my answer to your question is that perhaps if Beijing had more confidence in its sort of timetable for political reform, the timetable in their own minds, and had moved forward more quickly, it could have preempted some of the things that have happened. One thing that I talk about a little bit in the book is it was too bad that Beijing began to address universal suffrage when civilized protest was already evolving into less civilized protest. That made the situation much more complicated and spawned what sort of ultimately happened.
I think, Richard, you make a very important point, and that is when China signed up in 1984 versus 1997 when they get it, China is very different, Hong Kong was very different, the world is very different.
Yeah.
And so that explains quite a bit of things. But let me just ask you one or two things.
Sure.
Hong Kong was never meant to be a country.
Has
never meant to be an independent country.
Yeah.
Hong Kong is a city, albeit a very special city, right? So if you were Beijing, as you alluded to, I suspect that you would agree with many of the things I say, although please feel free to disagree. That is, how can you have a system that has a chance of Hong Kong electing someone which is contrary to Beijing, as somebody mentioned, and hence the democracy, and that's a very broad term. You can have all kinds of shades of democracy with all kinds of varying degrees of it. So when China talks about democracy, it may not be what American congressmen may be talking about democracy. There will be, certain barriers to possibility of undesirable outcome as far as Beijing is concerned. So am I not talking sort of cross-current with one another when your definition is different in terms of democracy? Then allow me to put in another thought, and please respond. The Brits are really brilliant. They have managed to create a kind of people in the world that is unique. Hong Kong is one of the very, very few people on earth that does not have any sense of nationhood or sense of belonging. Under the Brits, they make sure that you don't feel that you are a part of Britain, because otherwise you would ask to go move there, and they don't want you there. And a long time ago, they already set it up so that you can never get there. And they were also afraid that Chinese, Hong Kong people in the last 50, 60, 70 years would feel that they are Chinese, because Hong Kong is really quite useful to Britain. They make a lot of money here, among other things. And so they want to make sure that Hong Kong people don't feel part of China. And so every time there is anything to do with China, anything too close to China, they cut it off. So Hong Kong people has zero sense of nationhood. I gave a talk one time at Chinese University where you, once upon a time, lecture also probably, and I asked the student, MBA student, I said, you guys are Hong Kong people, right? Right. Tell me, where's your capital? Nobody answered me. And eventually somebody said, Victoria Harbour. Everybody laughed. Then somebody said, Central. Everybody laughed. Then somebody said, Lower Albert Road. Everybody laughed. And then finally a young man said, we don't have a capital. I said, wait. If you're a Brit, would you ever think twice before you say London? Or if you're American, would you think twice before you say you're, or Washington, D.C.? So they must be, come on. And they cannot give me the answer. For maybe 10 minutes, I brought them up. Tell me where's the capital. Nobody can tell me where the capital. Then finally, there's a young girl sitting way up in the top. And she said, Beijing? I know where she's from. She's not from Hong Kong. Her accent gives it away. Yeah. So I said, hey, wait. Somebody says Beijing, right? Could it be Beijing? And it took us another 10 minutes to decide that, yeah, it's Beijing. So now Beijing, right? Right? Nobody said yes. They don't even nod their head. Then I asked them a second question. I said, now let me ask you a second question. You're Hong Kongers, guys, right? What's your capital? Again, nobody answered me. And so after a while, I gave a conclusion. I said, the first time you didn't answer me is because you don't have a cognitive recognition of being part of China. And the second time, although you have already been convinced that Hong Kong is part of China and so Beijing is the capital, you still cannot answer my question because you have no emotional identity with China. And the Brits are so brilliant. Oh gosh, they are so good. They created a Hong Kong people that doesn't have any sense of nationhood. So how do you have popular election? Mm-hmm. Totally one vote with no, what do you call it, barriers or right? So how do you have the election when you have no sense of nationhood? What is the bottom line? Every American, whether you're from Donald Trump or whether you're from Hillary Clinton, when it comes to America's security, the defense, everybody agrees. They're all one. How you do it is another thing, but everybody is for, we are for America. In Hong Kong, nobody even say, I am for China. Or I shouldn't say none, but very few. So how do you have, you suggested popular vote, one vote. So how do you have that?
You may be giving the British far too much credit for their skill.
I give a lot.
I mean, I think they recognized fairly early on that sooner or later Hong Kong was going back to China. That's why they never embarked on the usual decolonization and political independence route. They made that choice early on. And I think they knew the place was indefensible. Maybe they didn't prepare the population for what was coming. It's hard for me to say. On your first question.
I know the answer to that one, by the way.
On your first question, it does require an act of faith on the part of the central government that most of the people here are sensible enough to know what their interests are, what their objective interests are, to recognize that people who have a very different vision of the city and how it fits into China are unrealistic, and to vote for people who provide a sensible and pragmatic approach. That is a leap of faith. I happen to think that that's a leap worth taking in this society. The longer this situation goes on, the harder, it may be hard to have that confidence. So maybe better to sort of do it now. There are sort of technical things that maybe should be done. You will recall that in the 1990s, Chris Patton instituted a sort of single-member district for LegCo. Mm-hmm. And the central government, when it took over, moved to a more proportional representation system for the popularly elected seats. Well, I know the reason they did that, and that is to strengthen the potential for the DAB. But it also created an opening for sort of radicals on the other side of the political spectrum, and I think promoted the fragmentation of the Democratic camp, which is not serving Hong Kong well. And so, something perhaps should be done about that.
Should Beijing jump and take the chance? I mean, look at Brexit. I mean, that's a result. And I don't know about Donald Trump. I know there may be some supporters, so ASI doesn't take any political position, but, most people would, I think, agree with me that if, how can Donald Trump be where he is today? And so should Beijing take a plunge?
Thanks for bringing me back to that. I think that we will wake up on the morning of November 9th, or it'll be the evening of November 9th by the time in this time zone, and see that the American people have done the sensible thing. That, they recognize Donald Trump for what he is and what he's not, and that Hillary Clinton, for all her faults, has a solid centrist vision for America and of America's interests, and make the good choice. What happens after that's another question.
However, if Donald Trump didn't have all these women problems in the last couple of weeks, maybe he will win.
If the Republicans had put forward somebody else, if they had nominated somebody else, then that person might actually become president. It would have a different vision of the national interests from Hillary Clinton, but it would still be within the spectrum. I think the Republican Party needs to do some self-reflection on how they created a set of circumstances that allowed this to happen. I hope they do. I watched, when I was working in the Congress, the Democratic Party take 12 years to figure out why they lost in 1980. And they did it by moving to the center with Bill Clinton. Staying on the extreme, they finally woke up and realized it doesn't work. Our country badly needs sort of a return to the center and a return to compromise. Polarization doesn't serve anybody well. But you do need to take a chance. You have to, cooperation can only develop over time. But at this point, this is probably, I think it's the best option, is to take that chance and trust to the good sense and pragmatism of the Hong Kong people.
Let me tell you a story, end with a story, if I may. 2 weeks ago, I was in Abu Dhabi. I bumped into a long-time Hong Kong resident. And he's from the mainland of China originally, but has been living in Hong Kong. He was a professor in the United States, and he came to Hong Kong, and he was been very successful in business in Hong Kong for the last, 15 years, 20 years. And he said to me, one time, he only met Chris Patten once. And Chris Patten, in a small occasion with about 5 or 6 of them, said that my job is to make sure that Hong Kong is unrulable after 1997. That's politics. It's not politically correct to say that. You never say that publicly. Doesn't surprise me one bit. You're naive if you don't believe it. Let me tell you, Percy Craddock. You remember Percy Craddock?
Mm-hmm.
I think I heard him with my own ears. He said some people in the British negotiation team made a proposal. He said, don't give them the British parliamentary system. Sock it to them with the American system. Meaning the separation of, the legislative and the executive branch. And so I think you're right that maybe I'm giving too much credit to the Brits, that they do something very, very well, but they also have their own interests. I think if I were British, I'll be very proud of Chris Patten. I think he protected his country's interests very, very well. But as far as Hong Kong people's interests, does he care? I wasn't born yesterday. I'm not that naive.
Mm-hmm.
And so such is Hong Kong. And by the way, finally, I don't think Hong Kong is a big issue at all. I'm sorry, Hong Kong is a big issue at all. I think Hong Kong is going to be okay. We'll play it out. I can give you a scenario, but I'm not a speaker, you are. But the last point is, in 1997, it's different from 1984. Mm-hmm. And 1997 is also different from today. Mm-hmm. In 1997, 20% of China's economy is one way or another related to Hong Kong. 20%. Today, that number is less than 2%. As far as China's Beijing is concerned, of course it's much better than Hong Kong for many, 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 many reasons, right? Substantive, financial, and otherwise. But if Hong Kong goes too far, hey, not a big deal. Singapore will be very happy. If Hong Kong loses its position as a financial center, Singapore will just benefit, that's all, which is okay. So, you have some final comments to what I've just said?
Let me tell you my hope that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we look back and or we see a Hong Kong that is prosperous as any advanced economy can be in today's world, but also stable, and in which most people, including young people, feel they have a stake in the system. We're 20 years on from what Chris Patton tried to do, whatever it was, and we have to address the situation as it exists now. I hope good choices are made all around. This is not just a Beijing problem. There have to be good responses here, and probably pragmatic ones. But the possibility is still there, and we shouldn't prejudge what happens, but hope for the best.
You predicted, Richard, about the U.S. election. Let me also predict about Hong Kong's future. Hong Kong will be fine. And I think 5 years later, we'll continue to thrive.
I hope so. I hope you're right.
As far as the question about the tycoon, how do they play out? What role do they play? I'm not one of those. But people say I am one of those. I can tell you what the Hong Kong tycoons will do. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll continue to invest in Hong Kong. I think we'll be okay.
Good.
Anyway, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
Thanks to Richard Wood.
Thanks very much.